Who's got the power?
We got the power.
What kind of power?
People power.
Who's got the power?
We got the power.
What kind of power?
People power.
Who's got the power?
We got the power.
What kind of power?
People power.
Who's got the power?
We got the power.
What kind of power?
People power.
Make some noise. Thank you all for coming. Welcome to our discussion on the roots of Juneteenth. Juneteenth is an actual real holiday that came into being before Joe Biden made it a federal holiday in 2021. We've been celebrating this for a very long time. And, even though there's always an effort by, the enemy forces to try and co-opt our holidays and try and make them some Disney-fied version of our history, we're here to learn the real story, the real revolutionary history of that and apply the lessons that we learned to our current conditions today. So before we get started, how many people is it it's your first time visiting the LC? How many people is your second time visiting the LC? How many people have to come up in here at least once a week? Great. Before we begin, I just would like to go through our Liberation Center Code of Conduct. So real quick, the Philly Liberation Center fights for the full social, political, and economic equality of all oppressed peoples. Discrimination or harassment on the basis of race, ethnicity, gender or gender expression, sexual orientation, religion, or ability is prohibited at the LC. Violations of this protocol will result in being asked to leave the space. The LC is a space that belongs to the working class of Philadelphia and is staffed completely by volunteers. We ask that all visitors respect the space and treat it as such. Please be sure to clean up after yourself. We do not work with the police or any kind of anti-working class organization or individuals.
That's right.
Police or any three-letter agencies are not welcome in our space due to their long and ongoing history of violence against working class and oppressed people. We're here today because we care. We respect that many of us here may have a strong emotional connection to or opinions about the subject. We require all visitors to engage in discussion in a respectful manner. We strive to build stronger unity with each other through discussion at the LC. Visitors who become hostile or refuse to engage in dialogue in good faith will be asked to leave the space. The use of illegal substances and smoking inside of our space is prohibited in the LC. We ask that volunteers who smoke do so outside and minimally 6 feet away from the entrance. Are we good with all of these community agreements?
Yeah.
Great. All right. Let's begin. Okay, so whenever we do any sort of political education thing, we like to let off with terms and definitions because we don't want to be super jargony. We want the information to be accessible. So we're going to go through that first. First thing, off-rip, right? So the first term of definition I'm going to go through is dialectical/historical materialism, right? This is a theory of historical change that explains societal development through the study of class conflict, right? So when we're thinking about how change is made through history, right? Dialectical. So this is a method and a lens of interpreting the world, right? You ever hear this stuff, people say, hey man, shit's changing. Yes, it is. Dialectical is basically shit's changing, but like, how does shit change, right? Okay, materialism. It's understanding nature as it exists. Ideas change the material world, and our material world changes the ideas, okay? So, when we talk about dialectical materialism, right, we're talking about like how things change. And there's 4 features of dialectical materialism that I'm going to go through with you all, right? So the first thing to remember, the first feature is the interconnectedness of nature, right? So that basically is no parts of nature can be understood in isolation without surrounding phenomena. So I want to give an example. So global warming, that's a real thing that's happening. But like somebody in Florida could say, oh, well, how could it be global warming? It's cold here. Well, that is a mistake in undialectical thinking because it might be cold there, but it could also be warm in Alaska. You're only looking at your own sort of tunnel vision to the exclusion of all the interconnected phenomena around the world, right? Also, weather isn't climate. They're very different things. Like weather could be a certain way, but the climate could be an entirely different thing. And it just so happens that the climate is heating up. Okay, state of motion and continuous change. Nothing is ever in a state of rest and immobility. Things are constantly moving, change, development, growth, disintegration, and decay. Everything is being, things are being born, they're developing, they're decaying, and then they're dying. And this comes with people and history and societies and nature and all of these things, right? Okay, the third feature. Quantitative change, small quantitative changes can lead to big qualitative changes. So, question for the audience, what happens to water when it reaches a certain temperature on the stove?
Boils.
Okay, and then what happens after it boils? What happens if it keeps boiling?
It evaporates.
Yes, and that changes the entire property. You no longer have water anymore, you have steam, right?
Right.
That principle is actually true in, the boiling pot example, but it's also true in society, right? Enough social explosions to a certain, in a certain frequency can produce an entirely qualitatively new thing. In this case, we in the PSL and at the Philly Liberation Center want to produce a qualitatively new system entirely, right? And we expect, a lot of different social upheavals to happen because of the system that we're living in, right? So, like another example, just like, police state violence, for instance, or like the 2020 uprising that took place, right? That was a result of years prior of other smaller quantitative uprisings in different parts of the country that led to a major explosion that took place in the 2020 uprising, or the uprising in Palestine, for instance. It can lead to mass mobilizations with millions in the streets. It raises consciousness, which ultimately it could, the resulting qualitative change can take many forms, right? Like it can take, them passing some reforms, like, hey, let's give the black people a Juneteenth holiday, right? Or it can result in a revolution in society, right? Okay, and then the final feature of dialectics is contradictions in the unity of opposites. So, it might be kind of confusing, but it basically is like all things contain opposing forces that are both interdependent and in conflict with each other, and that conflict within a certain thing drives development, right? Opposing forces are not just entities that are separate from each other, but it is their struggle against each other that drives development. They're linked in that way. They're constantly interacting, and they're creating a tension that ultimately leads to transformation. The struggle between the working class and the billionaires is a perfect example of this. That is a contradiction. We have opposing interests, opposing everything, opposing values, right? Okay, so contradictions. So contradictions are opposing ideas existing at the same time, tension between two truths. Another thing that I want to just throw in here, like, have you ever heard somebody say, like, every cloud has a silver lining?
Mm-hmm.
Right, that is a dialectical maxim, right? They're saying, oh yeah, here's a cloud, but hey, there's a silver lining in it. Both of these things are existing at the same time in tension with each other. Or light at the end of the tunnel, right? That's another one. Or waiting for the other shoe to drop, right? Okay, so contradictions. There's what we call principal contradictions, which are like the real big major contradictions, right, that we see. So for instance, in society, the struggle of the working class against the billionaire class, that is a core conflict. Whereas a secondary contradiction might be, struggles that take place within the working class, right? Like, I got beef with my neighbor across the street because they keeps on taking my trash can. You know what I mean? That would be an example of a second, which does happen. That would be an example of a secondary contradiction, okay? Who here can give an example of a contradiction? I know y'all got some. Go ahead.
All the money for militarism, but no money for education.
Say that one more time.
All the money for militarism, but no money for education.
That is the, yes.
That's a good one.
Absolutely, yes.
Banger.
Excellent. Okay, so primary contradictions, secondary contradictions. All right, and then the last definition we want to talk about is abolition, which we will be talking about a bit more about abolition and democracy and these concepts later on. So now that we've covered some of the terms and definitions, these are more than just phrases. They're ways to look at the world to look at history and current events unfolding before our eyes every single day. Now I'm going to bring up Comrade Gabby to go over some of this history.
Hi, everybody. So, as Joel mentioned, dialectical materialism is a tool that we can use to study complex phenomena, things that are happening that have a lot of parts to them. This is a tool for us to understand and analyze those events historically and presently. And so tonight we're talking about Juneteenth, which means that we're studying the phenomenon, the system, the social economic system of slavery in the United States in particular and how it ended. And so we'll be using this framework to think about the different contradictions that exist in this system, the tensions, and what ultimately led to the end of slavery and a new period in human and U.S. history. But in order to do that, I wanted to start by going back and putting us in the continuum of human history in general. I used to hate history in school growing up. I hated it. It was not my bag. I was a science and math kid. I feel like it was because I thought that it was more objective. It's just you have a right answer, right is right. But the history I was learning was not right is right. They were trying to tell me that Israel is anything, and that was wrong. So we have to go back and excavate and re-understand and study history in a way that actually meets our needs for the task that we have at hand. Once I became an organizer, I was like, oh, there's a point to all of this. Like, it affects us. So in order to do that for slavery, in particular, I wanted to start by talking about all of human history, because people like to act like Black people started in 1492. Crazy, because every scientist that is taken seriously will affirm that all of human society, humanity itself began in Africa. So you can't really have a conversation about Europe if you don't talk about Africa. Right. You can't have a conversation about anywhere if you don't talk about the origins of human history. So that's the first thing that I want to point out. The second thing is that obviously we're not just memorizing dates, so don't try and quiz me on these dates. I will not engage with that. And this is a model, all right? So models they always lose information. It doesn't contain all of human history, it's a timeline, for God's sake. So we're just gonna use this as a tool, again, to put us in the context of history and our experience as people. So the first thing I want y'all to notice, all right, hold up, this is us. This little red dot right here, okay? And all of this green and blue and that pink, this is class society. So this is where you have kings, queens, you have chiefs, tribes, stratification, all of this, okay? So this tan line represents class society. That's agriculture. All of this is the time before then. This is human society when it was just egalitarian, mostly matrilineal society. Look, hold up, we gotta keep going. Look at this. Look at how far back we gotta go of human society without classes. Most of human society is like this. So when people try to say that, oh, that's just the way things are and things will never change, that's crazy to say, because things are so much different than what they were even 100 years ago, even 1,000 years ago, 300,000 years ago. Things were very different. And so who's to say what the next 50 years, 100 years will hold, right? And so tonight we want to study what it means to go from this to, we're going. Okay, oh my God, that little blip, that is class society, that little blip, y'all saw that? A blink of an eye, things can change. So let me slowly approach today's time. We're at 49, okay, here we go. Oh my God, okay. All right, so about 8,000 years ago, we had the rise of what is often considered like so first let me say, across Africa, across the world, there's always uneven development. So what's happening in one part of the world, there are various things happening. We see that even today. So I want to contextualize that with that. But in general, like I said, it's agreed that human society and civilization began in Africa, in Egypt, and in the surrounding regions. So that was 4,000 or 5,000 years of all of this African Europeans developing culture, music, technology, medicine. The beginnings of modern medicine started during this period, literally. So like architecture, the pyramids built during this period. All of these advancements that nobody ever wants to talk about happened 1,000 years before we see the beginnings of civilization in Europe, okay? So Europe wasn't even a concept. People weren't even doing anything in Europe. They were just walking around trying to find food in the rocky soil. While Africans were building whole ass societies, okay? So I just want us to like think about that. Because I didn't get this story when I was taking my history classes. It didn't occur to me like that. All right, so then we have like various, empires rise and fall. We're not going to go through all the specifics of that. But then we have the Roman Empire, which I want to call out that once the Roman Empire fell, they went into the Dark Ages, and like the Europeans, and like language decline, hygiene. They didn't have running water for the most part. Mind you, in other parts of the world, they had, again, empires rising during the Dark Ages. You had the Empire of Ghana, which was known to have more gold than any other country or place in the world. The Europeans were kind of getting squashed on by like the rest of the world because they didn't really know that much or have culture. And so they got mad and started their crusades. That's what happened. They started crusading, going around the world mad because they didn't have enough in their place where they were at. Nobody told y'all to go over there. And then they started their crusades trying to gain food and enlightenment, knowledge, which is what they did. They stole information. They got maps. They got technology. They got, information from other parts of the world, which is what they used to then conquer the rest of the world. As they were taking that information, you think they were going around telling people, yeah, we're going to use this to conquer your people in 100 years. No, that's not what they said, but that's what they were planning. That's what they were writing in their little journals at Columbus. So we're going to get to that. A few more things that I want to point out here. Just a couple of key examples. So how many people have heard of Mansa Musa? Okay, good. Okay. All right, so more people than I initially anticipated, which is good. It's really good because we should all know about Mansa Musa. Right in the 1300s, in the middle of the 1300s, the Mali Empire had risen. People were like, oh my God, Mali's amazing. This was a Muslim empire. And this man is known to be one of the great leaders, the great personalities that comes out of Africa at this time. He went on a Hajj to Mecca with 60,000 people in his entourage, 500 bondsmen who each had a staff made of solid gold. He had 2,400 pounds of gold that they were walking around and just giving away to people. They were making friends. They were building libraries, building schools, building universities, spreading Islam. And wherever people went, writers would talk about how the group of people, that this whole entourage, that they were so disciplined, that they were kind, they shared, you never had to worry about getting robbed or anything like that. Tell me when in history you heard of 60,000 Europeans going anywhere and getting these kinds of reviews? Never! And listen, all right, so I'm just saying. There are many examples that are just not highlighted of what heroes can look like, what historical figures can look like, who are complicated, right? We can apply a dialectical analysis even within these empires and understand the contradictions between the oppressed classes and the ruling classes and all of that. But we can also look at the history and say, wow, that's an amazing thing to do. And like Columbus, who later goes around, like right around this time, he starts his voyages around the world, and he knows exactly what he's doing. He's robbing Africans, taking them to the Americas to force them to work. He was not out here like, I want to find new lands and discover things for my queen. No, he's literally trying to make money. He got a band of criminals. He said, if y'all act like we doing something else that we not doing, I'm cutting your tongue out. Like, he was a thug. He was a gangster. He's a villain of history. And yet we have streets named after him, schools named after him, the capital of this country named after someone this vile, and we don't even put no respect on Mansa Musa? What? That's crazy. So anyways, all of this to say, when colonization began, when this insanely destructive, violent colonial process of like the Middle Passage and U.S. slavery began, one, it was extremely intentional. The violence, all of that was intentional. People are like, look at it from the perspective of the people of that time. The people of that time did not want to be stolen from their lands, okay? Right. That is also documented. And on top of that, what was stolen is it's immeasurable. The amount of culture, like the kind of domination that was happening destroyed schools, right? Yeah. Destroyed communities, homes. It destroyed so much. And what does that remind us of today, right? We can't get back these historic churches that are being bombed by Israel, right? We can't get back the people that have been taken away from us, right? That have become ancestors. So I think I hit on all of the points on here. The last thing I'll say is, again, just looking back, the Kingdom of Benin, they had street lights. Mm-hmm. They had street lights in the 1400s when none of Europe had street lights. Okay, so the last thing I'll say, the information has been stolen from us as well. Like the bombing, the destruction of all these artifacts, it separates us from our history, and then it also makes it harder for us to even study that history and go back and reclaim it. So it's just really crazy. Like we should really think about that when we're considering what having a history and a culture means for Black people in the United States, which is actually what I'm going to get to now. But yeah, look at this little baby empire time. Like that could disappear at any moment. You never know. Like, okay. So. Okay, it's your fault. All right, so let me just put this. All right, so that kind of put us into the context of, world history before colonialism, and then we have some of the colonialism. We're gonna talk more about the end of slavery specifically. I'll turn it over to some other folks for that. But again, I just want to wrap up this section for now by saying, science, technology, medicine, land, agriculture, all of these things are what was stolen from us and from the continent. Governance and goods, language and culture, architecture, astronomy, spirituality, our understanding of what it means to be connected to each other in the land. All of that was robbed, and then stories were created about what was happening on the continent before Europeans got there. Europeans created those stories in particular. So, who here feels like you have had a clear understanding of all of these things that were stolen from Africa and Africans by colonialism? Just by show of hands, who feels like y'all really, from before you got here?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, here and there. Okay, everybody's kind of halfway putting your hands up. Why do y'all feel like it? Why do y'all think we don't learn this history in this way? I'm gonna take one or two people. Let's see, Olivia.
Yeah, because it would make people uncomfortable to have to acknowledge that this country is as great as it is because it was built off the back of free labor and just erasure of people's cultures. It's tough. Nobody wants to be the bearer of that, so it's easier to not talk about it.
Yeah, we'll take one more.
Yeah, if I was working inside of a home and I'm cooking, doing the chores and everything, producing everything for the people who own that home. And then I learned the history and I realized that, the home that I'm in, this is my home. Right. These people stole it from me. And I'm going to want to do something. Right. Yeah, I'm going to want my home back.
Yeah, from the beginning, from day one, Europeans they knew they had to find ways to convince Black people and whoever they were oppressing, indigenous people included, of course, who were genocided through all of this, that it was justified. They had to create a story both for themselves and for the people being oppressed, because frankly, they didn't have the numbers to enforce this kind of system. Right. So they had to colonize the mind. That is a necessary part of this process in order to maintain such a system. So part of that is the stories that they tell. It's the history that they destroy and recreate in their own image. It's the way that they manipulated the Bible and a number of other holy texts to their advantage. The way they manipulate science to their advantage. So it goes really deep. Language is another thing. The languages that we speak come out of this culture and this way of relating to the land and to each other. And so we kind of have to think really critically about how we communicate and how we're going to be able to get free with the language that we're speaking and the history that comes with that. So all of that was,
When you go from
I thought I was going to be ready. Okay, so we're about to watch 2 videos, and then I'm going to start to wrap this up. But we're moving into the present day, but sort of fast forwarding through like slavery in a way. But let's watch these videos.
when you go from a nation to a when you go
Hold on, wait, I'm going to get this. I got it.
when you go
Okay.
when you go from a nation to a state, as was the case of Europe, nationalism is dominantly.
We gotta start over. Everyone's gonna hear this.
When you go from a nation to a state, as was the case of Europe, nationalism is dominantly negative. When you go from a state to a nation, as is the case of Africa and the colonized countries, just arriving at freedom, nationalism is positive.
We're not American. We are people who formerly were Africans who were kidnapped and brought to America. Our forefathers weren't the pilgrims. We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. The rock was landed on us. We were brought here against our will. We were not brought here to be made citizens. We were not brought here to enjoy the constitutional gifts that they speak so beautifully about today. Because we weren't brought here to be made citizens today, now that we've become awakened to some degree and we begin to ask for those things which they say are supposedly for Americans, they look upon us with hostility and unfriendliness. If you're interested in freedom, you need some judo, you need some karate, you need all the things that will help you fight for freedom. Nationalism is the wave of the present and the future. It is nationalism that's bringing freedom to oppressed people all over the world. It was nationalism that brought freedom to the Algerians. It was nationalism that brought freedom to the Nigerians and to the Ghanaians. It was nationalism that brought freedom to the people of Uganda and Tanganyika and Sudan and Somaliland. The Africans didn't get it by sitting in. They didn't get it by waiting in. They didn't get it by singing "We Shall Overcome." They got it through nationalism. And you and I will get it through nationalism.
Period. All right, so after 400 years, how do you all think the enslaved and colonized African people relate to the places that we came from and the places that they're in? How have 400 years of oppression and resistance shaped us? Again, if we fast forward through history a little bit to a time that some of us may be more familiar with, Europeans used religion and violence, including disease, to capture, murder, and enslave millions of Africans across the tortuous Middle Passage. Again, this was very intentional. When they took people away from their homes, they knew that they were going to force folks to work. Like, that was the goal. Most enslaved Africans, about 11.5 million, were brought to the Caribbean and Latin America, and a large number, about 400,000, ended up here in the U.S. South, and 10 million, if not more, died on the journey. And our ancestors endured about 400 years of this brutal and dynamic system of slavery, all while resisting every step of the way. In our perspective, these 400 years of forced unpaid labor not only laid the basis, the economic basis for U.S. capitalism, but also forged the Africans from different parts of the continent who were brought to early U.S. society into a new, unique nation. In the PSL, we uphold the position that Black America is distinct from other nationalities, particularly white America. We agree that Black people in the US represent our own nation, an oppressed nation, and much like Irish, Palestinian, or Nigerian people, we too have the right to self-determination.
Right.
The PSL sees Black people in America as a colonized people, a colonized nation within this larger oppressor nation of the United States, this larger empire, really. And like many other national liberation struggles, we need not only a socialist revolution, but a national revolution to see US imperialism, capitalism, and white supremacy crushed and to take over our own communities. Woo! So when we uncover this true history of our nation, and when we realize, like Brother Malcolm said, that we didn't land on Plymouth Rock, it was Plymouth Rock, the rock that landed on us. When we understand that it will take a revolutionary nationalism that was described by Brother Touré, then we can expand our vision and deepen our inspiration of what freedom and resistance really means for our people through art, through science, through spirituality, through politics, and much more.
That's right.
So to connect it back to today, to wrap up this section, I want to ask y'all, what are some examples of resistance that we see today, either in popular culture or that relate to the historical points that I just raised? We'll have send the mic around too. All right, to Sierra and then Becca.
I actually my favorite. Oh, this is my hi. Hi. I don't know what's going on.
You just switch it up. Turn it on.
Yeah, the light is being weird. Yeah. Okay. All right. The reclamation of our Black American spiritual heritage as no religion hoodoo. That's been really important because that is that melting pot or that amalgamation of different Africans coming from different places and then coming to America and making our current nation and reclaiming spirituality, sometimes hiding it in the church, sometimes hiding it in the saints. But hoodoo is very important to Black Americans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great example. And then we'll take one more from Becca.
The first example I thought of was when we talked about decolonizing the mind, the Black, and I know I speak from the diaspora, the Black American diaspora. The Black is Beautiful Black Power movement that arose in the 1960s, and I would say personally has traveled throughout the early 2000s at least in mainstream media, was a huge help in masses of people who otherwise don't have, formal education or may not have come across African history on their own, to take the time to research their history, to decolonize their mindset, at least how they view themselves and their place in America. And I think, unrelated to the question, but kind of related to the question, is how do we take that decolonized mindset and then not turn it into, but also incorporate the anti-imperialist mindset as Black Americans living in the United States in today's time? Like, how do we, it's not just enough for us to be Black nationalists, it's important for us to be Black nationalists and anti-imperialists. So how do we apply that in the Black Power movement and our culture today?
I think that's a great question, and we don't have time to go into it, but I think revolutionary Pan-Africanism is a great place to start in terms of addressing that question and developing that internationalist perspective among our people, like not just Black people. I think that's a question for all people in the belly of the beast, is overcoming U.S. exceptionalism and realizing that we have more in common with our working class siblings across the world than with our capitalist oppressors who want to kill us all before they give up their money. Well, with that being said, I want to thank you all for going on that journey with me through human history. We can't allow ourselves to start the African people's story at the time when they were shackled. It's a disservice to our people and to everything that was stolen from us. And so now we're finally going to get into the Civil War, and I'm going to turn it over to Timur to talk about how we got there.
Peace, everyone. Thank you all for being here. I'm excited to share some historical material that I put together largely based on W.E.B. Du Bois' great book. And also his 1909 book, John Brown, which was really the book that set him on this trajectory to eventually becoming an icon. So the period leading up to the American Civil War was defined by the side-by-side development of two interdependent but contradictory forms of capitalism. On the one hand, Northern industrial democracy, which depended on the products of slave labor in the South for its export and manufacturing economy. And on the other hand, the slaveocracy in the American South, which depended on the North and on Europe for buyers. Both the Northern and Southern factions, factions of the ruling class were united in this context in their support for slavery. So the North and the South, the political elites, both wanted to maintain slavery, but a sectional conflict developed during this period because they had contradictory interests regarding whether new states that entered the Union would be free states or slave states. And so part of the reason behind this was the infamous 3/5 compromise enshrined in the reactionary Constitution of the United States. The Southern faction won out in that instance, and they got enslaved people to count for 3/5 of a person, whereas the Northern ruling class, for completely reactionary reasons, not for abolitionist reasons, just didn't want them to count at all. So shame on them. But the North's support for slavery meant that the first stages of this period were defined by a very conciliatory posture toward the South, basically giving in to whatever demands that the South made in order to prevent secession and keep the Union together. And so an instance that really illustrates this is the famous caning of Sumner, where a U.S. Senator Sumner gave an anti-slavery speech on the floor of the U.S. Senate, and pro-slavery Senator Preston Brooks came up to the front and beat Sumner like viciously with a metal cane until he was bleeding profusely and seriously injured, and didn't suffer any consequences for this. Was allowed to walk out of the Senate floor without being like anything happening to him, and he suffered no censure or anything like that. So this to me is like a vignette that illustrates the broader Northern posture toward like slavery in the South on the part of the political elites. But the sectional conflict began to boil over into armed conflict in the period that's known to history as Bleeding Kansas. And so as the North and the South competed, so that the new states entering the Union would be, their side, free states or slave states. The 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act was like a flashpoint for this struggle, turning into armed conflict. So according to the Kansas-Nebraska Act set a referendum in Kansas where people would vote on whether Kansas would enter the Union as a free state or slave state. And in an attempt to sway the outcome of this referendum, people that are known to historians as border ruffians, pro-slavery gangs from Missouri began crossing the border, entering into Kansas to terrorize the people living there who opposed slavery, and just to influence the vote illegally in any way that they could. And so the people living in Kansas at the time, who were predominantly German immigrants, opposed slavery not only for like narrow kind of economistic reasons, but out of moral opposition. And some of these people included Joseph Wedemeyer and August Willich, who were communists. They knew Marx and Engels personally, and Willich had actually led military regiments in the 1848 revolutions in Europe with Engels as his aide-de-camp, his like right-hand man. And so there's this kind of faction of anti-slavery immigrants in Kansas that were in armed conflict with these border ruffians. And so these were some of the events that led to the intensification of the class struggle. The last point on the slide that I wanted to talk about is that we started off by talking about the North and South as a unity of opposites. Another kind of dialectical thing to think about in this case is that class struggle can take many different forms depending on the context. It doesn't always look like forming a union. It doesn't always look like going on a rent strike. it can take many different forms. And so one of the central forms that class struggle took during this period was the Underground Railroad. Like escape was a central means of class struggle. It was a strike action, right? And so, for instance, after escaping slavery, I want to talk about these two kind of folk heroes. Harriet Tubman led like dozens of missions back into the South, risking her life and her freedom, and freeing reportedly like 70 or more people from the shackles of slavery. John Brown, it's not often recognized that John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry was an attempt to establish a permanent armed outpost of the Underground Railroad behind enemy lines. And so his raid on Harper's Ferry, while ultimately unsuccessful, like was a catalyst in changing the political climate of the U.S. from one in which people who opposed slavery did so privately, morally, but weren't doing anything about it, to one in which, you know, he laid down the gauntlet. He said, I'm willing to die for this. Who else is going to struggle militarily? So I wanted to just ask a question here. Like, there's all of these contradictions bubbling under the surface, and yet, you know, this is a 40-year period following like a 400-year period where these contradictions somehow didn't explode. Like that in itself should be remarked upon. And so I wanted to ask you all to just think, why is it that these contradictions were able to be contained in this period? And what led to the beginning of the US Civil War proper, like formal military hostilities? Just asking you all to kind of think critically about this historical moment, you know, speculate or share knowledge that you have.
Repeat it one more time.
So why did these contradictions not explode? And why did they explode when they did? Why did the Civil War begin when it did? Yeah.
I think because for such a long time, they were making so much money off of expanding and slavery, and, you know, the United States, it was so new. So I think that's a big reason why. And also, you know, they're also still part of like, you know, Britain for a while, and they were making money. So there's conflict with Britain. And then once they got, you know, their own independence, I think that's also could be a part of it too.
Steve, thank you, bro.
Yeah, you talked about Kansas. There was a war in Kansas. You had people who they didn't want to be ruled by slave owners. It didn't mean that they were abolitionists, but they didn't want to be ruled by slave owners. And the slave owners took control of the state. So there's a revolution, an armed revolution to overthrow the government. And one thing is, you read Frederick Douglass's autobiography. Frederick Douglass worked on the docks in Baltimore under slave labor, and then he came north and he looked at how they did it in the north. And he said that 12 people in the South did the same work as 3 in the North. So you had this profound contradiction that the slave owners were taking control of the whole country. That was their goal, to make this an agricultural slave country. And similar to what happened in Latin America, is that you had the latifundia, the landowners taking control of everything, and that hampered the industrialization. But here, the northern industrialists were able to go to war and actually defeat the slave.
Yeah. So thank you. Yeah, that's great, and I think we'll keep moving for the sake of time. Did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I just remember one more thing from W.D. Boyce that I read.
Let's keep going for the sake of time. I just don't want to go over my
Real quick.
Okay, yeah.
Got a question.
Sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify when you mean explode, like, because there was a lot of resistance going on, so I'm just trying to figure out what you mean, like explode. Are you talking about the Civil War? Or?
Yeah, I guess I'm just talking about like why did formal military hostilities begin when they did, given the fact that there was such a long, intense struggle leading up to it. that moment. Okay, so I'll keep going. So, eventually the American Civil War begins proper, and I want to talk a little bit about Du Bois' general strike thesis. So he writes in Black Reconstruction that at the beginning of the war, quote, "Neither the North nor the West asked that black labor in the United States be free and enfranchised. On the contrary, they accepted slave labor as a fact, but they were determined that it should be territorially restricted and should not compete with free white labor." And yet the American Civil War was a war about slavery. It ended up being a social revolution, a revolutionary war for abolition. So what happened in between? How did this constitutional war to preserve the Union become a revolutionary war against slavery? Well, W.E.B. Du Bois argues in his book Black Reconstruction that it was the action of the black proletariat, the general strike of black people fleeing the conditions of enslavement and insisting on the Union Army as an abolitionist army that caused this to happen, that turned the war into a revolutionary war against slavery. And so he refers to this as a general strike. And through this general strike, a contradiction between factions of the ruling class, the factional struggle between the North and South, was turned into a social revolution against slavery. And so this is like just something to pay attention to. It happens in other revolutionary moments as well. Like in the Russian Revolution, a dispute within the bourgeoisie, a dispute within the ruling class was taken advantage of by revolutionaries to institute a socialist revolution. So we always, in our strategy, in our revolutionary organizing, we're always exacerbating the contradictions within the enemy camp and trying to unite the people's camp as much as possible. But I just want to read a short section from Black Reconstruction that dramatizes this event. So, Lincoln could give an Emancipation Proclamation if you wanted, but the condition of its success was this general strike by enslaved people in the South. The Union Army didn't have military control over the South. And so Du Bois writes, "Despite all argument and calculation, and in the face of refusals and commands, wherever the Union armies marched appeared the fugitive slaves. Not that the government planned or foresaw this eventuality. On the contrary, having repeatedly declared the object of the war was the preservation of the Union, and that it did not propose to fight for slaves or touch slavery, it faced a stampede of fugitive slaves. Every step the Northern armies took then meant fugitive slaves. They crossed the Potomac, and the slaves of Northern Virginia began to pour into the army and into Washington. They captured Fortress Monroe, and slaves from Virginia and even North Carolina poured into the army. They captured Port Royal, and the masters ran away, leaving droves of black fugitives in the hands of the Northern army. They moved down the Mississippi Valley, and if the slaves did not rush to the army rushed to the slaves. They captured New Orleans and captured a great black city and a state full of slaves. These fugitives who began trailing the Union Army and eventually joined its staff and finally its combat units were actually leading the Union Army. They were the vanguard of the class struggle. As combat units, these black soldiers gained a reputation as courageous and steadfast soldiers. Their intervention forced the Union Army to function as an army of abolition. Many Union soldiers were inspired to adopt abolitionist views themselves by the righteous struggles of the black regiments they fought alongside, but it was ultimately the self-organization and the class action of the black proletariat that turned this constitutional war between elites into a revolutionary war for abolition. And so just two quick takeaways and kind of lessons. That first, Du Bois recasts this Civil War and Reconstruction period as a social revolution, and we as revolutionaries should inherit this moment for all of its sort of lessons that it has for us. And the other part is that, a connection to the present, is that don't let anyone tell you that revolution is not possible in the United States. It's already been begun. It was already started, and these things happen not linearly, but in jumps and starts. And so the task of socialist revolution in the U.S. is the task of taking up the unfinished project of Reconstruction that Shane is going to talk to us about in a moment.
I know that's right.
Just wanted to open up for discussion briefly before I turn it over to Shane. So the next kind of set of questions that I had were, what did you learn about the Civil War in school? So I think probably people have very differing experiences regarding this question. And so we'll start there. So does anyone want to just share how this period was taught to them in school? Yeah.
We learned that John Brown was, we learned that John Brown was absolutely insane. And that was really telling. We also, I did not know about Du Bois until college, and I apologize for mispronouncing his name because my professor, that was the way my professor said it, and
Already fucking it up.
so yeah. All right.
Yeah. Du Bois writes in his book about how this narrative of John Brown is crazy actually put the South in an impossible situation, because either he was crazy, in which case why did they need to like have this whole trial and prosecute him and all the people that followed him? Like there's no risk of anyone following because he's just a crazy person. Or he's not, in which case obviously the entire fabric of their society is rejected. So I think, yeah, that's a really important dynamic to think about. Anyone else want to share? Yeah.
So I went to boarding school, and I thought at the time that they were like really progressive. We read Du Bois, and Frederick Douglass. But at the end of the semester, like one of our writing assignments was to like write an argument. Write an essay that argues about why you think the Civil War was fought. And the way that my professor, who I really liked, pitched it was like, people have written papers about the premise that the Civil War was fought because of the discovery of algebra, or like because of like completely unrelated things. And so it kind of like over academicized this thing that doesn't really have like too many ways to read it. Maybe like being too permissive.
Yeah. Sure. Confusion through an overwhelming amount of detail is a classic ruling class tactic.
Yeah.
So, yes. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Just briefly, I don't remember a lot about what I learned on the Civil War, but I do kind of just like vaguely remember Abraham Lincoln. So, uplifted, like he was that guy. And like February, I think it was I know it's President's Day now, but I think when I was growing up, it was like two like holidays. I think it was like George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, if I can recall. But just really quick, there's one thing about like Harriet Tubman, because you had Harriet Tubman and John Brown up there, and one thing like Harriet Tubman, she fought with the Union right during the Civil War, but Harriet Tubman was actually a recruiter for John Brown. Like she was recruiting Africans to fight to overthrow the United States war. Like John Brown went to Frederick Douglass, and Frederick Douglass was like, I ain't trying to get involved. Not that he didn't disagree, but he just thought it wasn't doable or practical. But Harriet Tubman was like organizing folks to join John Brown. And John Brown called Harriet Tubman, her nickname was General Harriet. That was her name. So, and I say that to say too, like Africans who did fight in the Civil War, like they would have fought with the Confederacy if the Confederacy would have abolished slavery. It wasn't all about the United States. So there's like this tradition of Africans who fought against the United States in the Revolutionary War, and in the War of 1812, where they fought to overturn the United States. And I think like that's an important history. But yeah, I just wanted to uplift that.
Yeah, that's such an important narrative to combat the idea that Lincoln like free the slaves, like as if one person could do that, as if history is not made by the millions, the masses of people.
Right.
Right, and then also, I mean, something that historians argue about the raid on Harper's Ferry is that it didn't involve any black people. That's completely false. So it was a multinational. So I think with that, thank you. I mean, thank you for that. That's extremely important to mention, and for all of your participation. And with that, I'll pass it off to Shane, who's going to talk about Juneteenth and Reconstruction.
All right, peace everyone. Okay, so going off of things that we were taught in school about the Civil War, about Lincoln being the great emancipator, and sort of top down being like, all right, all slaves are free now, and the slaves being like, thank you, Mr. Lincoln. That's not how it happened, right? We already went over that. The North wasn't particularly concerned about abolishing slavery, but more so saw the enslaved people resisting slavery, which has been a thing since the institution has existed, right? And sort of using that as political leverage to win the Civil War. I mean, as a matter of fact, before we even get into Juneteenth, right? The 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery except as a punishment, it wasn't actually ratified until a few months after Juneteenth. And slavery wasn't even formally abolished in the border states of Delaware, Maryland, West Virginia, Missouri, and I might be forgetting another, until December 1865, not June 19th. But Juneteenth, June 19th, 1865, General Gordon Granger marches into Galveston, Texas, and issues this decree of emancipation, right? But I want to point out two very important things about this. One, a lot of the enslaved people in Texas were aware of the Emancipation Proclamation. They were aware of the Civil War. They were aware that people were gaining their freedom. And a lot of people, the amount of desertions from plantations, the amount of resistance increased. But it wasn't until there was a military power that occupied Texas that the freedom was really won and enforced. And I think that brings us to the second point, is that emancipation had to be enforced, right? It was a military occupation. It was something that had to be organized. It was something that was militant. In the same way that I mentioned before, that Black people have resisted slavery for as long as the institution exists, right? And that's not just in the U.S., right? That's also in Haiti. Throughout the history of what was formerly called Saint-Domingue, the slave colony, the sugar colony, there were constant slave revolts. There were constant rebellions. Masters were getting killed all the time. But it wasn't until one, fighting amongst the ruling class in Haiti, amongst the big whites and the poor whites and the free coloreds, that there was an opportunity to militarily organize to crush the institution of slavery. And another point that I wanted to make is, we see how much history we had to cover to even arrive at this stage, right? Now Juneteenth is a federal holiday. Professional workers, get the day off while a lot of other workers don't, and it's this really tragic irony of like a bunch of white people getting the day off. But yeah, this is the actual date of Juneteenth. But I think the points that we want to make, it wasn't something that was granted from white people, right? It was something that was fought for and won. So moving on to the Reconstruction era, I would like someone to read this quote up here. Does anybody want to read this quote? I might have to volunteer.
Great.
The oppression of Black America is so central to the country that the struggle for Black liberation has often acted as a detonator, so to speak, setting off broader social struggles throughout the system. In today's volatile mix, the charges now rigged to blow may be too difficult for capitalism to withstand.
Woo!
All right, so after the Civil War, the North wins, the South surrenders, and we enter this period called Reconstruction, in which the slavocracy is crushed, and there was this experiment in radical democracy to replace the slavery-based plantation economy. This is where you see the first public schools in U.S. history. This is where you see advancements in healthcare. This is where you see expanded political rights, including universal manhood suffrage for the first time in large part in U.S. history. This is where you see the first sort of like officially recognized Black political institutions, where you see the first Black congressmen, senators, governors. And all of this, right? It was unfinished. Not only was it unfinished, it was defeated. Now this slide it says it was defeated by political compromise and fascist violence. I want to break this down a little bit more. So we talked about how the North didn't necessarily want to abolish slavery, right? The goal was to keep the country unified, or to keep the ruling class unified. And the abolition of slavery, or the Emancipation Proclamation, was a sort of political trump card that was used. So there were sections of the ruling class, including in the North, who weren't really married to this idea of equal rights between white people and Black people. And this is when you have, after the assassination of Lincoln and the inauguration of President Andrew Johnson, who was, a white supremacist, an avert about white supremacists, starting to walk back and not really, continue to support this project, this project of Reconstruction, which once again I really got to emphasize. Like, this was a military occupation of the South. Like, they had to enforce equal rights onto into this area, so that the former rebel soldiers, former slave owners wouldn't try to re-implement slavery. So when people talk about freedom and democracy and autonomy, we got to talk about freedom for who, democracy for who, autonomy for who, and to do what, right? Because I'm gonna be real, I don't care about your freedom to own other human beings.
Right.
And so you had the sort of the rank and file and the masses of Black people being essentially like a lot more radical than the ruling class that was overseeing Reconstruction. So the ruling class, it compromised. It did what it did before the Civil War, right? It appeased the interests of these racists, of these slave owners and slaveholders. And this is where you see the rise of fascist vigilante groups like the Ku Klux Klan. A point that I want to add about the KKK, and also the sort of question of I'm sorry I sound like a broken record, but this military occupation of the South to enforce equal rights, is that I think it's important to note that this sort of fight between, say, like autonomy and authority, the people arguing in favor of autonomy aren't always right. Like the KKK, you could, in a real twisted way, you could argue that like, oh, these were like autonomously organized people who were fighting against the state. Okay, but they were fighting to own slaves. To implement. And jokes aside, they were largely successful, right? Reconstruction was defeated. And Jim Crow, apartheid, was implemented in the South. And it took another social revolution to get rid of that. Another unfinished social revolution. So, to conclude with this point, there is a relationship between socialism, abolition, democracy, and reconstruction, right? We get told that things can't change because they've always been this way. But hopefully, as y'all have seen throughout this entire presentation, that is not the case.
Oh, right.
Right. If we can fight to crush the slaveocracy, if we can fight for equal rights for all people, if we can fight for the first public schools, for better health care, for these services provided by the state, then we can also fight for state power. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Gabby to talk about Reconstruction's unfinished business.
Period. All right, so picking up exactly where Shane left off. Should I use this?
You don't need it.
Okay. We actually just kind of synthesizing what we just talked about to more outline this social revolution that was the Civil War that created that led to the end of abolition or the end of slavery, legalized slavery, except in the case of punishment, and opened up the era of Reconstruction. Then we have the reaction, the betrayal of the Union Army that left the South, that stopped enforcing this equality. And then the Black Codes came, which is also known as the Jim Crow era. The KKK began to rise, along with other kinds of fascist violence, which is a whole other thing about fascism. Imperialism is right there. Yeah. The United States is doing everything that we say the fascists were doing. Like, they started much of that alongside their other partners. So in any case, without moving on from that digression, but we had the Jim Crow era and then the Civil Rights Movement, which Shane outlined, we could also call the Civil Rights Revolution, which resulted in another period of social upheaval, of changes, of new rights being afforded for Black people, for women, for LGBTQ people, etc. And then there was a reaction to even that. Unfinished business. There was a second revolution, and then they started mass incarceration. They pumped our communities full of drugs. They defunded our schools. They defunded our communities. They wiped out so many of our unions, right? So like we're in this era, but we're also coming out, we're also in a very tumultuous period, right? Like we can't just we're everything's always changing, right? It goes back to the beginning. And so that's where we are now. What is it gonna take for us to finish the job? Our ancestors did it, then their ancestors did it, and so the baton is on us. And so we're going to get into a discussion. Well, actually, hold on. Let me say my points real quick. All right. So tonight we've gone from a point where Black people were the leading authority on science, on spirituality, on nation and community building, to a time where in the most powerful country on the planet, we are targeted and killed every day by state violence, whether it's through police killings outright or through criminal neglect. Black people in Haiti, in Cuba, here in the United States, all across the continent, we've had practice at overthrowing our masters and asserting our humanity. But we also don't have a crystal ball of what comes next. But I do know that I want to contribute to a world where we actually treat all African nations with the kind of dignity, respect, and admiration that is earned from being a generous and wise people. Okay? So this doesn't come from just imagining a new future. We have to actually understand the social, economic, political, and historical dynamics of conquest and collaboration. So it's been a global fight since Europeans got off their backs and started going across the world trying to assault people and invade the rest of the world. And so now we need to ask, what is it going to take for us to win that fight? So to move us into the, okay, I'm going to get this mic one more time. Can you all answer 2 questions for me? All right, first question. What was the impact of slavery and then emancipation on the growth of the U.S. as a global power?
Speaking as a Filipino American, my understanding is that they went on to colonize a lot more places because they really liked having free labor and really underpaid labor, and they continued to exploit and try to grow and be the imperialists we know them as today.
Yes, they made a whole playbook. They took it across the whole world. Yeah, Mecca and then Joel to wrap this up. We'll go to the next question.
There are still a lot of large and very powerful institutions who are made their profit, their original profit off the back of enslaved Americans. JP Morgan is one of them. Wells Fargo is, selling plantation land. They've got most of their money off of selling enslaved people. So it's just, those institutions still very much have a huge amount of power and influence over the country we live in today, whether it's the creation of the modern day police department off the backs of slaves, and you can talk all day the invention of cotton gin and how that affects U.S. capitalism as a whole. It's the impact is still there, and that capitalism that was built off of enslaved individual is what holds us in the position that we are to stay as a global power. It paid for the bonds, it paid for the bases that we have in every country across the globe. It pays for us to occupy other countries so we can take cheap and free labor. So we can take oil and pillage them for their goods. It's like that money came from somewhere, and 9 times out of 10 you can trace it right back to slavery.
Great point. And then Joel to wrap us off.
I think one thing that the ruling class learned at the end of slavery, or at the end of at the end of the Civil War and through emancipation, was in a period of great upheaval, if there's a couple of us that can stabilize the situation, we need to contain the emancipation part, right? We need to make sure that doesn't get too out of hand. And if you fast forward 80 years after the end of the Civil War, fast forward 80 years was also the end of World War II. And I think the ruling class in this country decided the same thing. It's like, okay, cool, we defeated the Nazis, but there's this emancipatory political movement called communism, right? And we don't like that at all, right? It reminds us of the Reconstruction era. So what did they do? They looked at Germany, they cut it in half and said, hey, we're gonna put these Nazis right back in power, just like that they put the slavocracy back in power in the South under different rules, right? And then they formed NATO and basically said, hey, we're going to basically do the same shit the Nazis did, but we're going to do it collectively, and we're going to keep on doing that for decades, right? And they're still doing it today. So the containment of emancipation, I think, was something that they learned, and likewise, we need to learn how to contain their containment, right?
Awesome. Oh, we're going to move on to the next question. Okay. So, last question. What were the transformative possibilities under abolition democracy?
Yeah, I think I'm thinking about 2 things. The first being, I don't know if they definitely didn't acknowledge it in the moment, but now having to see African Americans as people or equals, right? At least on textbook on paper, not that people were really excited about that. But that this country was starting to become a melting pot. And I don't know how widespread that is. It's different people of different ethnicities living in the same place. That definitely was very rare back then. And we still don't have a lot of countries like that. But I mean, that's I believe one of the reasons why America is so great, because there's just such a mixture of people's mindsets and perspectives and cultures that we can all come together and build stuff. The second thing was just emancipation or abolition kind of laid the groundwork for, not even kind of, but just other transformative movements. The belief that a group of people can actually be seen as humans with time, right? Their status can, through their own fight and justification, can be like raised. That just made it a possibility that I feel like people didn't see, couldn't fathom before, right? Having a guidebook or a textbook of, peaceful protests in order to get your point across, that definitely inspired a lot of other alternative movements. Not alternative movements. You know what I'm saying, guys? Yeah, take the mic with you.
Thank you for the question. Yes, we have one more comment up here from Talia, and I'm sorry, I'm looking at Talia, from Caitlin, and then Steve.
Yeah, I think with abolition democracy, it really was an opportunity to unite the classes. So instead of, just seeing marginalized communities completely separate, or, people couldn't go to school unless you were rich. There was no education. There was no higher learning. It was just working, whether it was working on a farm or working in different areas of agriculture, whatever that is. And that's for like poor white people, Black people all across the board, and other marginalized groups. And so I think for the first time, finding those points of unity between those people and uniting from the class. And then, like we learned earlier, that means the opposite was true too. The ruling class is uniting faster than ever. Of like, maybe that's why later it's like the Black bourgeoisie starts to pop up. Like maybe that's where that happens, because it's like, where can we find the points of unity to strengthen our cause and to strengthen our purpose? And that happens on either side.
Do we have time here for one more? Yeah. Okay, great. Go ahead. I turned it off. Sorry.
Yeah, as you said, this was a revolution, and it had revolutionary effects. One was specifically with Du Bois. His mother was a maid. She couldn't afford to send him to college. They took a collection to send him to college, based on the transformative attitude that people had. 350,000 people died, and it was for a reason. See, and it was that consciousness that made them finance Du Bois' education, and that education, healthcare, it was a transformative thing in the former slave states. Can you imagine going from being a slave to sitting in Congress? And all the ideas that came around that. Now you're in the government, and finally, the defeat of Reconstruction. They tell us it was about Plessy versus Ferguson in the Supreme Court, but no, it was a war. They took the Union troops out, and then the KKK, which is similar to the Zionists today, they went to war against anyone who supported the transformative things that were happening in this place, and they weren't all Black people,
right?
So that's why it was a military defeat, and Plessy versus Ferguson just recognized that happened. So it's.
Thank you, Steve. We're gonna wrap up this question for now, but we're about to get into some group discussion so we can hear from more people. I'm very excited that folks' hands are being raised because y'all can share. So. Great point. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and get into. I want to comment too. Okay.